What I like about the problem that you're solving is this is actually, a big issue for gig workers, but I also feel like for just normal people driving.
Definitely seen this increase over the last really 10 years as more and more people have turned to e-commerce and expecting those deliveries and those deliveries next day, food on demand. And then obviously the pandemic really accelerated that to another level.
In the future, drivers are going to be increasing their earnings because we can cut the wait time by 5 minutes, on food delivery.
What we've really focused on at Automotus is providing a solution that is automated for a driver.
Kelly, I guess now I'm thinking your nickname could be kind of like the queen of the curb. How does that sound?
I won't argue with that. That sounds good to me.
Welcome to the Rideshare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
All right, so Kelly Ferguson is Chief of Staff at Automotus, a curb management company on a mission to create safer, more efficient, and more sustainable streets that work for everyone. Kelly draws upon 15 plus years of experience in new product development, public-private partnerships, community engagement, and emerging technology deployments. Before Automotus, Kelly was the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator's first director of pilots, responsible for the planning, deployment, and operations of emerging zero-emission transportation pilots in the Los Angeles region, including the nation's first zero-emissions delivery zone in Santa Monica, California. That's where I'm from, Kelly, by the way. As Chief of Staff, Kelly has supported Automotus, Curbside Analytics, and smart loading zone rollouts in LA, Pittsburgh, Omaha, and more. So, Kelly, I guess now I'm thinking your nickname could be kind of like the queen of the curb. How does that sound?
I won't argue with that. That sounds good to me.
All right, cool. Well, it's Christmas time, and we'll see if we can get some swag made up for you in time. But really excited to chat with yourself because you've got a ton of experience and also learn a bit more about what Automotus is doing. We've obviously seen this huge shift in delivery, and I guess my site is still called the Rideshare Guy, but I might have to change it to the last mile delivery guy because really the past 2-3 years has been all about food delivery, package delivery, and so we're seeing a ton of interest there from all sides. So would love to dive into it with, into things if you're ready.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely seen this increase over the last really 10 years as more and more people have turned to e-commerce and expecting those deliveries and those deliveries next day, food on demand. And then obviously the pandemic really just accelerated that to another level. Yeah. And across the board, we're seeing effects of that in cities when it comes to getting that last mile delivery done. The challenges and the competition for the curb, the way our cities have been operating for so long, we've really had just cities not allocating curb space for their proper use. And that's really one of the things that we're trying to tackle.
Got it. Well, I'm excited to dig into what Automotus is doing. But before that, I sort of like the direction we're heading, kind of setting the stage. So you talked about the last 10 years, we've seen this shift in, more packages being delivered. I think the obvious example that people think of, I'm ordering more stuff on Amazon these days, food delivery with DoorDash and Uber Eats. How do you think about the different verticals of delivery and kind of how it affects your work?
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we got parcel delivery, we have food delivery, gig drivers doing delivery, ride hail, all of those things. We consider that kind of largely commercial activity at the curb.
Got it.
So commercial activity. Yeah, commercial activity at the curb is now 50% of what we see in terms of curbside parking. And if you look at any curb, that's not reflected there. And so that's one of the big things that we're trying to tackle is working with cities to help them better right size how the curb is used, and then having solutions that make sure that the curb is being used in the proper way, the way that we want to see. So if it's a loading zone, you've got loading happening.
Got it. So do you mean that, typically most curbs, either are kind of a free for all, anyone can park anywhere, or they're metered, put in a quarter and pay for 15 minutes. And the use, 50% of the use cases are more package delivery, ride hail, or food, which would be, if I'm an Uber or Lyft driver, I just want to pull over for, hopefully less than a minute, the passenger comes out quickly, or food delivery, I'm kind of in and out in the restaurant in a few minutes, versus like kind of, I guess most curbs and most parking is kind of more designed for someone who's going to be there for, I don't know, half an hour, 15 minutes, an hour, or something like that, right?
Yeah. So we ran a survey last year that showed that drivers spend more time looking for parking than they do actually the pickup and the drop off, right? So that's really showing that you look at any curb, very few spaces are allocated for loading, and oftentimes they're just not being used properly.
Yeah.
And using a meter, using an app, all those things take time.
Yeah.
And so what we've really focused on at Automotus is providing a solution that is automated for a driver, so that they can get in, get out, they register once. And then they are essentially charged by the minute for parking. So you don't have to pay for 15 minutes, use it only for 5. You're getting if you're there for 5, you get charged for 5. So
very cool. Very cool. All right. Well, that's a perfect segue into how Automotus is tackling this challenge. So it sounds like you guys have an app, and I guess give us the quick pitch on Automotus and, sort of the overall company and, some of the mission there. And I guess we can dive into sort of the app and the tools and solutions you guys are using to solve these challenges that we've, laid out so far.
Yeah. So, as you mentioned in the intro, we're on this mission to help make curbside parking more efficient, reduce congestion, reduce emissions, and reduce the number of tickets that drivers receive, and double parks, and increase safety across the board. So we work with cities to help them identify how their curbs being used. We use computer analytics so that we can tell, peak demand happens at this time for delivery. We're seeing a lot of double parking at these locations. And so we give that real-time view into what's actually happening. So one, cities can make the right decisions policy-wise for how they want to reallocate curb space. And then 2, we do automated solutions. So we automate parking at the curb through smart loading zones. And essentially those zones are pay by the minute zones that have a graduated rate in most cases, so that the longer you're there, the more you're paying per minute. And that really incentivizes that turnover so that those locations are being used, what I would call it properly. So you'll have higher turnover, less double parking. And then ultimately that benefits the drivers that are using them because they have a more efficient system. They're getting fewer tickets, things like that.
Yeah, no, I like that a lot. And actually, it kind of reminds me of when I go to charge my Tesla. Once you're done charging, if you leave your car there, they start charging you, like 5 or 10 times the amount, because obviously you're done and they want you out of there. So I think that concept and those incentives make a lot of sense. And so I think this is a challenge that, what I like about the problem that you're solving is this is actually, a big issue for gig workers, but I also feel like for just normal people driving, normal people walking, like this kind of affects everyone, right? I think the stat you mentioned, right, about people, drivers specifically spending more time looking for parking than picking up and dropping off. Like obviously as a driver, especially here in Los Angeles, I've looked for parking. And so I think everyone can kind of resonate with this issue, right? How do you think about sort of general, I guess you would say, population of drivers or people versus sort of the gig workers or sort of commercial activity specifically?
Yeah, what I like about what we provide at Automotus is it's one of those rare win across the board. We're taking an asset, which is curb space, this thing that's been overlooked for so long. And we're making it operate much more efficiently. Yeah. And that's a benefit for any driver, a gig driver, a delivery driver, somebody going to work, because you have less congestion. If you're a cyclist or a vulnerable user on the street, you have less double parked vehicles. It's a safer situation for everybody. You have less damage to your vehicle, double parked. So all of those things really, and it's a win for cities too. And so it's one of those, kind of unique solutions where it provides value across the board because because historically curbside parking has been so poorly managed.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And cyclists, I think, are kind of a good example of where you might not immediately think of them as a huge beneficiary here. But I know on Twitter, I see a lot of, I don't know what it's called, bicycle Twitter or something, but everyone who likes biking, I follow a bunch of them. And, I always see them complaining about, delivery vans blocking bike lanes. And I totally empathize with that. But at the same time, I understand as a delivery driver or a ride hail driver, like I got to pick up, I got to drop off. There's nowhere to do it. The passenger wants to be, dropped off right in front of the building. And if I don't do it, or I don't know how to sort of, gently pull around the block, right, they might leave me a low rating. So I do feel like, even cyclists, right, like kind of would potentially benefit from something like this really greatly, because this is like a huge safety issue, with people, opening car doors into bike lanes and things like that, right?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, so let's dig into some of the solutions. You mentioned a couple of the smart loading zones, and let's dig into what is the actual product that Automotus is creating. I guess you mentioned one thing that's interesting is how are you guys collecting the data or informing these decisions, and then we can talk about sort of more the user side of things, the actual gig workers, and some of the pilots that you're doing there.
Yeah, absolutely. So fundamentally, we have two core offerings. The first one is this analytics product, and we operate using computer vision. So we install cameras that have a view of the curbside, and so that tells us, roughly, a number of spaces. It could be, 1 to 4 or 5 spaces along the curb, and so we're able to detect the type of vehicle, whether it's a passenger vehicle or, I say, a Class 8 freight vehicle.
Oh, cool.
How long that vehicle is there, so the dwell time. We can also tell the type of propulsion, so if it's a zero emissions vehicle or a combustion vehicle. And then other things such as, traffic in the corresponding lanes next to the zone, as well as, double parks, as I mentioned before. So all these things kind of go in and paint this picture, and our analytics platform can kind of tease out those details of,
Gotcha.
peaks that we see on a regular basis of certain types of vehicles or any sort of violations. And then next, we offer a solution that really helps that behavior change, right? It's one thing to know how this all works. And I think everybody's like, okay, there's a loading zone there, but a car that shouldn't be there is parked in there forever.
And where do you put the cameras? And they can typically see, I guess, some sort of degree angle and see 4 or 5 parking spaces at once.
Yeah. So typically they're on streetlights.
Okay.
Yeah. And so we work with the city or whoever is the owner of streetlights to be able to install those. And, the way we kind of identify those areas is we work with the cities or with business improvement districts, local businesses, to identify, those areas of concern. So sometimes it's anecdotal information. Sometimes cities have information that tell us the best places to put those.
Yeah. It's also not rocket science either, right? Like, where all the deliveries are happening, or you just look out on the streets, like, oh, especially if you ask any driver, I'm sure they can tell you like, oh, this area is where a lot of orders happen, or this area is like, avoid this area, to be perfectly honest too, right? Because it's like, oh, there's a lot of traffic there, a lot of congestion, or a lot of deliveries happening, right?
Yeah. And honestly, though, like this is an interesting conversation because one of the challenges that we have as a company, and I think some of the cities have too, is that conversation with drivers.
Yeah.
A lot of times we don't have that kind of access. We can try to have that access, especially with some of the bigger companies. It's really hard to just be like, okay, where are you having trouble? We want to help you.
That's a good point. I feel like in a lot of these situations, it is interesting to me because it's sort of like obvious to me, right? Especially, for some area that I'm familiar with, but you're right. The cities may not have visibility into that, or you as a company, you may not be operating and, have that sort of local knowledge. So I do think sort of like finding a good way to recruit those drivers and sort of leverage, like I always tell people, like if you just go out and drive for a week or two, you'd probably pretty quickly figure out, like the problem areas, the good areas, the restaurants to avoid, things like that. So that definitely seems like a unique opportunity to sort of leverage that gig worker perspective to help here.
Yeah, absolutely. The second solution that we offer, that's more of the kind of behavioral component of it, is the automated loading and automated paid loading. So we have what we call smart loading zones. And so you register once, you register your payment information, and essentially you have a wallet. And so every time you use a curb, one of these smart loading zones, you pay by the minute. Yeah. And so that makes it a completely, hands-off system for drivers to use after they've registered their vehicle. And what we're seeing in the cities that we're currently operating in are number of much higher parking events and reduction in double parks. So this is, a benefits for all, and it's a great tool for cities and drivers to have access to.
So it sounds like the gist, right now, if I'm a DoorDash driver, for example, and I go to a busy part of town to pick up or drop, to pick up, I guess, an order, I guess you would say, right? Typically, it's like challenging to find a parking spot, or I have to double park or park in a red, risk getting a ticket. Right. And in this situation, it's basically a one-time registration in the cities where you're operating one of these smart loading zones. And now I have a digital wallet, and every time I pull into a spot, it automatically sort of sees that I'm there. And, can I reserve spots, or how does it work on the sort of gig driver's side?
Yeah, right now it's passive system. So we don't have registrations available in the cities that we're working in, although that is something that we can do. But we found that really it's if the locations are enough, you have enough locations in an area, and you have that registration component to the smart loading zones, it really you have that much more availability. We found in other areas when you do things like registration, you need a really strong enforcement mechanism, and that's really.
And when you say registration, do you mean the first time registration, or are you talking about more reserving? Like if I have an order coming up and I can reserve it, a spot.
I'm talking about just the registration for the loading zone program. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And so you're saying that drivers in this program, how do they register for it then, or how do you work with?
Yeah, so we have a website, and anytime that you go to one of these zones, they're indicated by signage, sometimes by curb markings, and then there'll be the ability to scan a QR code or go to the website, the URL itself, and do the registration there.
Got it. So it's sort of like a quick pay for parking one-time kind of experience, and then now I'm locked and loaded for the future, right?
That's right.
Okay, cool. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is, right now, what's the experience been like working with drivers? How receptive have they been to this? Because obviously I imagine that, right now I pay nothing directly, right? Like in the short term, I'm not paying for parking usually, or I might be putting in the meter, but I am risking tickets or, driving around the block, and that's costing me money. And so I'm always curious about, this is like a medium to longer term value proposition for drivers. Like it definitely makes sense, but I'm curious, like how receptive have they been to that? And what have you found is like the most effective way to message it to them or to get them to register, in general for this type of pilot?
Yeah. So you highlight some really interesting points there. And we've been seeing that in some of our feedback from drivers. We issue out some surveys to get feedback and scores. And we found that the more the drivers use the zones, the higher the score is. And I think that is reflective of that kind of, short-term versus longer-term view, because you can say, oh, I'm paying for this parking spot that I didn't have to pay for before. But what you don't maybe take into account is that you have more access to that space. You don't have to double park and risk getting a ticket. You don't have to search for parking as much. And so you're having that faster pickup. You're able to do more deliveries in, a normal shift. You're potentially able to get more tips because you have faster delivery, better delivery. So all these things really benefit drivers in the long term, and really, hit on some of those core pain points.
Yeah, I really like the sort of idea or the messaging of like faster pickups and no tickets, right? Because that's one thing that, I'm always worried about if I'm doing a delivery, right? It's like, oh gosh, it's like once in a while, right? And even like if you do find a parking spot with a meter, sometimes you're like, oh, I'm just going to risk it, right? Because it's like, oh, some like parking in Santa Monica, for example, I'm from Santa Monica, so I'll throw them under the bus. It's like 50 cents every 15 minutes or something crazy like that. Like that cuts into your earnings pretty big time. So I guess speaking of that, how much is it to park, for example, in one of your cities, per minute, or how does it work?
Sure. Yeah. So for example, in Pittsburgh and in Omaha, we're looking at a graduate structure. So the first 10 minutes of parking is $1. So you're talking like 7 cents for the first, 5 minutes or so. So it isn't that much that cuts in. And then over time, what we're trying to do is incentivize that turnover. So the longer that you're there, the more you pay per minute.
Gotcha. So for the first 10 minutes, it's $1, and for 5 minutes, it's 7 cents. Is that what you said?
No, for 5 minutes, it's 7 cents a minute.
Oh, 5 minutes. It's 7 cents a minute. Okay. So it's pretty cheap for the first 5 minutes, basically, like you were saying, it's almost, negligible for the first 5 minutes. But it does, like if you had to do $1 on every trip, that would add up over time for drivers. And so this kind of makes me think like, for drivers, we always tell them, whether you're doing people or packages, like you really only get paid like when your wheels are moving and you've got a person or a package or a food item in your car, right? Like that's the time you want to, maximize, you want to minimize all the pickup and the drop off and all that. So I am thinking like, for a lot of delivery drivers, there's restaurants that are kind of like, we like to avoid them because they take a long time. So how do you think about the interplay between restaurants or, the kind of, or even the platforms really too? Like there obviously are more parties involved. Like if I find this great parking spot, I go into the restaurant, but then I have to wait 10 minutes for the order. It's kind of costing me, right? So I'm sure you've experienced some of these challenges, and how are you guys thinking about those and how to best work with everyone?
Yeah, that's an interesting challenge. And what we've done a lot, particularly in Pittsburgh, we've done a lot of boots on the ground work, talking to local businesses to kind of understand, one, to let them know, like, this is a zone that's planned nearby your building, and to talk to them about some of the problems that they face in terms of pickup and delivery, whether that's from, gig drivers or just, food and drink delivery, things like that. So we do have that interplay between, before we launch, and with the local businesses. Once they're launched, it's, some of the information that we get, whether it's the analytics or some of the payment information, we're able to kind of determine, is the zone working? Is this appropriate? We haven't yet kind of gotten to the point where you've got that interplay, like, oh, this is a restaurant that takes a super long time. I think we'll get to there. We have plans for more kind of informative policy decisions and later iterations of our analytics. And I think that will be kind of a core thing to see, like, when you've got a lot of restaurant delivery happening, how can you identify whether or not you need maybe a little bit more leeway for some of these locations to make more sense? That's, some pretty intricate, policy discussions that could result in some tricky situations there. But I think, that's a really interesting thing for us to continue to explore.
Yeah. Well, so high level, where do you think Automotus can have the biggest impact, either directly to drivers or businesses? Like if you kind of had to pick one thing, it's like, oh, wow, in the future, drivers are going to be increasing their earnings because we can cut the wait time by 5 minutes, on food delivery. Or is there any sort of one area where you're like, wow, this is a great use case for the Automotus, product and the company?
Yeah. I mean, I think for us, it's about turnover. So the more turnover you see at a loading zone, that means you're seeing that throughput, and that kind of results in all those other things. That means less congestion, that translates to less emissions, fewer people circling the block, and that means delivery drivers are getting in, getting out in a more efficient fashion. So I think that to us is one of the really key things, because a lot of things trickle down from there, and it really just says your curbs are being optimized for the proper use. So that's the main thing that we look at.
Got it. What are some of the bigger challenges you guys have faced in rolling out the smart loading zones or getting drivers to adopt this technology?
Yeah, I think with any new technology, it takes time. It's something that is new both for cities and for drivers. So I think in one aspect, it takes a long time to, at least in our first rollouts, it took a long time to get rolling, because it's an educational opportunity for both us as a team and for those cities. And then for the drivers themselves, it's new. So drivers have to become more familiar with this. It's not an app, it's not a meter. And so there's definitely a learning curve with that. And so we've been working both on the ground, standing at a zone to register drivers, to, making sure our signs make as much sense as possible, or as easy to follow as possible, customer support, all of those things. And it takes a while. We've been in Pittsburgh now less than a year, but coming up on a year in Q1 of 2023. And so we're seeing that increase in registrations. Another conversation that people bring up is, how do you enforce something like that? And so there's a lot of different ways to do that, whether it's kind of more of a lighter touch or a heavier touch. And that kind of depends on the city that we're working with and what tools they want to use. But those are other ways that we work to increase registrations.
Got it. So it seems like there's a pretty good appetite from cities for solutions like this. I think you've mentioned that you're doing pilots in Pittsburgh and LA and a couple other places. Is that right?
Yeah. Yeah, so, probably the most notable one of the last year is our Smart Loading Zones program in Pittsburgh. And that's been going since about April and recently got extended for 2 years. And we're going to be expanding to up to 200 locations in the city. So that's a really good example of showing how this automated payment system really works. And we've seen an increase in turnover of up to 20%, and then also a decrease of double parked by 20%. So this is really a signal, even though it's been less than a year, that these really can work. Especially as we're seeing more activity at the curb. We're seeing more people come to cities because they're going back to work, all these things. So I think these are all really, really strong signals, and cities obviously want this to work well. And so we're very excited to have that chance to even more with Pittsburgh. And
got it. So is there anything unique about the Pittsburgh program, or is it pretty much what you've described? You've put a number of cameras on streetlights and then made a certain, you said 200 locations. Does that mean 200 cameras or 200 parking loading zones?
Yeah, so currently we're at about 20 loading zones, and then we're going to be increasing to 200 in the coming year.
Got it.
And so, right now what that looks like is essentially 20 cameras or 200 cameras. And then those can monitor up to, 20 to 60 feet. So that could be, a couple of 2 to 3 loading zones. And it kind of accounts for different size vehicles, right? It might be a passenger size vehicle or a larger vehicle that takes up more space.
Got it. Very cool. And what is there any data that you guys have pulled from the Pittsburgh? You mentioned increase in turnover of 20%. So that means that, before, if there were 100 cars coming in and out of those loading zones, now there's 120 cars. So it's like more cars are able to get in and out of those spots more efficiently.
That's right. Yeah.
Or vehicles, I guess you would say, since there's a bunch of different vehicles.
Yeah. So we're able to see that increase in vehicles. So we're tracking that. Those percents are over kind of the entire 20 loading zones that we're looking at. We're also able to identify and work with the parking authority and the city to identify particularly problematic areas so that we can help make those, work better for delivery drivers to use. So that's what we're seeing, right now.
Got it. And so of this commercial activity at the curb in Pittsburgh, for example, do you have sort of a broad sense of, what types of use cases? I mean, is it sort of, 25% like parcel delivery, 40%, rideshare? I don't know how much granularity you have there, but I guess like who's kind of using these loading zones in Pittsburgh, for example? Yeah,
for the most part, if I were to kind of take a big picture view, it's mostly we see mostly passenger vehicles. And so that usually dictates that it's some sort of pickup drop off for gig work. We do see a number of delivery vehicles, and those are usually clustered at certain times of the day on particular days of the week that we've seen, which has been pretty interesting. In other cities, we've seen, interesting clusters where you see Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday for package delivery being a big one, because you kind of understand like different types of buying habits, or somebody wants to buy a bunch of stuff on Monday and then you see the deliveries throughout the week. So we're able to kind of get some of those high level data points that we can share. The city can see them themselves through the dashboard, but we can also highlight those as well.
Yeah, so that's interesting. One thing that we've always seen on the delivery side is that there's very distinct peaks, like with Rideshare, for example, you can basically flip your app on at any time in the city of LA and it's like pretty busy, Friday, Saturday nights might be more busier, but it's like always busy, right? Whereas with food delivery, obviously lunch, dinner, Sundays, holidays are pretty distinct peaks. And, the food delivery companies actually usually encourage drivers to schedule shifts because I think they're able to more effectively predict that demand. So it seems like a good opportunity too, that, with different verticals of delivery, right? Like packages, maybe they can be delivered, at lower demand times for food delivery. So you don't have like two people fighting over that same spot.
Yeah, I think, I don't think we're quite there yet, but in an ideal next step or next few steps is that more dynamic approach.
Yeah.
And that would be something where you try to incentivize these, the shifting of peaks so that not everybody's trying to use the curb at the exact same time. So maybe you try to incentivize, maybe it's through pricing or just through access, the ability to kind of take parcel delivery and shift it to a different time, so it's not competing with food delivery drivers at at the lunchtime peak. So we're not quite doing that yet in cities, but that's definitely the direction that we're aiming to go.
Cool. So there's one other thing, that I've been thinking a lot about over the past couple of years, and we're sort of seeing this shift already, especially in places like New York City with couriers delivering on e-bikes and some in San Francisco. Not so much in LA. I would say probably 90% of drivers are delivering with cars, but there also are some cool companies like in LA. There's a company called Pico that rents out these little scooters, kind of moped type vehicles. And so it's obviously great for, getting in and out, and they're cheaper and, easier to park and things like that. So what do you think about these other modes? I guess you would say like smaller, more eco-friendly, cheaper vehicles. Like I just love the e-bike kind of delivery use case, right? Like in a busy downtown area, you just pull right up into the sidewalk on the Starbucks, you run in, grab the order, and you're out in like 10 seconds or less. So how do you see these fitting into the equation?
Yeah, I mean, we're able to track things such as pedestrians and cyclists.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's something that we track through our analytics. I think transitioning to those smaller form factors is definitely makes a lot of sense in particular cities. And I think that really can help the overall problem that, we're also aiming to solve. Those those parking areas, if it makes sense for those vehicles to use, and there's not, in those kind of larger senses where you've got the cargo bikes with, larger trailers, things like that, those vehicles could use those spaces in particular cities that we're working in. I think in most cases they'll be using, the sidewalk itself. But yeah, those are all things that we're tracking, and
cool.
Definitely we're working on a particular project with zero emissions delivery zones, both in Santa Monica and in LA. And extending a lot of that work out into Pittsburgh as well as part of a Department of Energy grant. And so all those things are, we're looking at if incentives for zero emissions vehicles, whether it's decreased cost of parking or just preferred access, if that can help transition more drivers over to zero emission vehicles, that's another thing that we're exploring as well across those three cities.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, no, I'm definitely a big fan of the e-bikes and kind of delivery use case. And so I think it's still a bit early, but I do think we'll see a big shift there just because it's sort of so much better in a lot of different ways. And, so you've mentioned a survey that you've done. I know you periodically survey drivers and gig workers. Are there any interesting findings from your most recent survey? And then I know we're going to be working together to sort of get this new survey out to delivery drivers. And I think it's a really cool opportunity for delivery drivers who right now, kind of have this big challenge with pickup and drop offs. They can sort of have a say and, potential impact on, making pickups and drop offs smoother. And then like we talked about earlier, no more tickets and, make more money per hour because you're doing more, deliveries. So very cool.
Yeah. So, I hit on a couple of things earlier, but some of the big things that we learned, and this is probably not going to be a surprise to anybody listening that's a gig driver, is that, that parking is really hard, and that drivers rarely find parking at the curb when they first arrive at a location. So that results in a lot of circling or illegally parking. So opens you up to tickets, all that kind of, those negative outcomes. And, it takes drivers usually 4 to 7 minutes to find parking, which is often longer than it takes to actually go in, get the meal, come out. So all those things result in bad outcomes for a gig driver who wants to have as many deliveries as possible, wants to get as many tips as possible. So, that's what we learned last year on this survey. And we really want to have an opportunity to reflect year over year on how these things are changing. Obviously, there was the pandemic, and things have been changing a lot. And so we want to see those trends over time to make sure that what we're creating as a product is beneficial to drivers. Ultimately, drivers are a core customer of ours, just as a city is. And so we want to make sure that we have a solution that's as seamless as possible and really benefiting gig drivers or all delivery drivers in their most kind of hits those most painful points and helps alleviate that.
Very cool. Well, we'll, for the drivers who are listening or watching right now, we'll leave a link to your new survey that they can actually fill out if they're a delivery driver and talk a little bit about, sort of like what you said, their experience parking and picking up drop off and how long they're waiting at the curb. And I think it might be interesting too for them to share, some opportunities or pain points, right? Like maybe there's certain restaurants or, certain areas, like with the driver community, there's certain restaurants that are kind of like notorious for long wait times, right? So it's kind of interesting to start getting to that next level.
Yeah, absolutely. I think anything we can, would love to hear from as many drivers as possible, in particular, any of the cities that we're currently in or launching in, to get that, on the ground feedback is super critical.
Very cool. Well, we'll leave a link in the notes so that drivers can go ahead and fill out that survey and make their voice heard and improve things for everyone. So that'll be really exciting. And then, of course, we'll share the results once those are live. But definitely a cool opportunity for drivers there. So I think we've kind of hit on everything that I wanted to know about Automotus. We highlighted a few of the pilots that you're doing and kind of some of this real world use case, and then, of course, kind of the experience for Give Driver and the survey. Is there anything else that you want to touch on before I let you go and get back to the curb?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think we covered a lot of the core things that I wanted to talk about today. I think for the most part, we're seeing a lot of really good momentum across a number of major and kind of smaller cities that are really addressing curb management head on.
Yeah.
I talked a lot about Pittsburgh today, but we're going to be launching in Omaha, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and a number of other cities, including, expanding out in the LA region in the coming year. So we're really excited about that opportunity to have an offering that's, more prevalent across the country. And we're seeing more and more cities get serious about how to manage curbs effectively. Like, Seattle, New York, all, a lot of the big cities are all looking at how they can make delivery drivers more prevalent in terms of curb space. And so I think that's a really, really, really positive sign. We've seen so much competition at the curb, not just the increase, but, we have parklets, we have all sorts of different uses for curb space now. And so it's going to become more and more challenging to do that curbside parking. So people are really paying attention to it now.
Yeah, you're definitely speaking my language. And I guess it's one of the reasons why I co-founded a conference with Jonah called Curbivore.
Yeah, there you go.
Although I do give him credit. He was the one that came up with the name. And so I'll give him credit for that. But definitely totally agree that there's sort of more and more demands on the curb. And it's cool to see that, cities, I think, are, obviously have a big impact here, right? Because they are the ones who control the loading zones. You need to work with them to sort of put your technology on the street lights. And so I think it sounds like you've got a lot of buy-in there and a lot of momentum there. So we'll be definitely excited to see, these pilots and Automotus operating in more and more cities. And hopefully for gig drivers, less tickets and more pickups and drop-offs per hour. Absolutely. So really appreciate you coming on, Kelly. If folks want to learn more about Automotus, some of the pilots that you're doing, or even sort of register maybe for in some of these cities, what's the best place? Should they go to Automotus website? And we'll also leave a link to that survey I mentioned in the show notes too. Yeah, so you can go to our website, automotus.co, which is automotus.co, and you can register there, or app.automotus.io. Very cool. All right, Kelly, really appreciate you coming on, and take care. All right. Thank you.